What is going on, everybody? We should be live right now on YouTube, Rockfin, Rumble, and Twitter. Hopefully, Twitter's sometimes it be hit or miss at Twitter, but I think we're good on Twitter too.
Never know.
So we have a very, very, very special show for you guys with a very special interview with some groundbreaking stuff. We have a special guest, Adam Garrie. Adam was part of a duo that wrote this brilliant article about a biolab. This time, the biolab wasn't in China, uh, and allegedly, hopefully, this time Fauci wasn't behind it. But just like issues with the biolabs, like the issues with the biolab that led to this quote unquote outbreak during COVID, the CDC isn't really doing their best job handling it. And the more attention that gets brought to it, the more government officials want to look the other way. So I want everybody to welcome to the show, Adam Garrie. What is going on, Adam? How are you doing, man?
Doing great. Great to be with everyone. And yeah, let's get pathological about pathogens, I guess.
So you wrote two articles, actually, and I believe the second one actually just released today, correct?
Second one just came out today, and there's more where that came from. So it's a big series all on this subject and its implications and all of the horrors yet to come.
The first one was called A Lid on an Illegal Biolab Teeming with Deadly Viruses. And the second one, which released today, and if you're on YouTube, the link is in the description. How a California, no, excuse me. That was the second one. The first one I said was the second part. The first one was called How a California Code Enforcement Officer in a Small California Town Blew the Lid on Legal Biolab Teeming with Deadly Viruses. So, first, Adam, what brought your attention to the story, and how did you come about this information about the officer that blew the lid open on the story?
Well, at the beacon and in my personal life, I'm always looking for stories that are interesting for the public, that are important for the public, but that tend to get overlooked in the mainstream. I mean, right now, I think if you look on the other page on Twitter, you'll probably see people arguing over an interview that hasn't happened.
Yeah, right.
When people are arguing over what hasn't happened, they ignore some of the things that have happened and continue to happen, and the major implications. And the reason the implications are so big is we all just lived through. Some would call it a pandemic, others would call it a plandemic, some would call it a scamdemic, but we all lived through it. Everyone had strong opinions on it, and everyone's life was changed temporarily. Many people's lives were changed forever. And many people think, myself included, that the origin of that pandemic was a bioweapons lab or a biosafety lab, as the CDC calls it, a bit like how they measure radiation in something called sunshine units, something George Carlin brought to everyone's attention in the 90s. But be that as it may, these biolabs experimenting with some of the most deadly pathogens on Earth pose a clear and present danger to everyone on the planet. We got lucky in a sense that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, was comparatively crude insofar as it didn't lead to the kind of deaths that we saw during the Spanish influenza outbreak, that we could have potentially seen in a global Ebola outbreak, or that we could see if they were to engineer something that was more effective from their point of view and less crude than SARS-CoV-2. So the issue of these biolabs, what they do, where they are, how they're regulated, and should they even exist, is a big subject. It's one that former CDC directors were concerned about. The current one and her predecessor, not so much, but we should all be concerned about it if we don't want to live through another of what we just came out of, or worse.
Absolutely. So walk us through really fast. What did this particular officer blow the lid on? And for those of you who don't know, it's not just about, which Adam will explain, it's not even just about what was in the lab or the lab itself. The origins of the person involved with facilitating the creation of this lab is just as shady as the goings on within the lab. So go ahead and let us know how this code enforcement officer just kind of stumbled on one of the biggest stories of the year.
So it's almost like an Al Capone story where it's the thing you least expect that gets you. So there was this unlicensed, illegal, unauthorized biolab operating in a small town called Reedley, California, just outside of Fresno. And it was located in an abandoned warehouse. But the local people saw people going in and out, cars pulling up in the middle of the night. And so they sent a code enforcement officer, a woman called Jessalyn Harper, who I had the great privilege of interviewing, a great public servant, more on that soon. And as she was examining the property, she noticed a makeshift little garden hose protruding through a hole they drilled crudely in the side of the building. And she thought, right, well, that's a code violation. So she gained entry to the property, and what she saw was something that she didn't expect. It's something, Wuhan meets Pinky in the Brain. And she went in and she saw vials of pathogens, some labeled in English, and the names were frightening. You saw Ebola on a refrigerator. You saw vials marked HIV, COVID-19, any disease you could really think of. They had the labels. And then there were just as many that were not labeled at all, and others that were labeled in Mandarin Chinese with no translation present. She also saw lots of mice, lab mice, the living mingling with the dead, and the living weren't in very good shape at that. And after speaking to one of these workers in what turned out to be this illegal biolab, they told her that these were what they call transgenic mice, which are mice that are genetically engineered to take on human features, in this case, the features of the human immune system. And another worker that said that they were engineered so that they could transmit COVID-19, not a virus that's natural to the rodent population. So we think. And so the stuff that was going on here was very disturbing for two reasons. One, labs that are legal, although very underregulated, especially in the private sector, do these kinds of experiments and hold these kinds of substances on a regular basis. Many of them are in urban and suburban areas. They could be anywhere near schools, near homes, near hospitals, near restaurants, near places where you really wouldn't want an Ebola fridge and HIV sitting on the shelf and SARS-CoV-2. You just wouldn't want that, but they are. And this was essentially the same, only much dirtier than most and totally unregulated. And so after her initial shock, she blew the whistle left and right. But as I'm sure we can get into, at first she was more or less ignored by all of the agencies and all of the people that you would think should care most about this.
That's how it goes, isn't it?
You would think.
That's how it goes. But that actually is a good segue into the guy who the lab allegedly belonged to, because when we're talking about something that's getting ignored like a biolab, there's usually somebody who has some type of investment within that lab that can, request that professionals look the other way, organizations look the other way. Can you talk a little bit about the guy who was responsible for this lab?
So the man who owned the whole operation, and the operation actually went even beyond the holding of these substances and these experiments with the mice. He was a Chinese citizen, well, still is, and his name was Jesse Zhu, but he also went by the pseudonym of David He. He entered the U.S. unlawfully after running away from Canada as a fugitive because of a 333 million Canadian dollar judgment against him for intellectual property theft regarding the agricultural sector in the US. So it was a Canadian court that fined him for IP theft from the US. And so in that great American tradition, you go to the place, you return to the scene of the crime. And that's what he did. The companies that were registered in his name were registered in Nevada without any license to operate any sort of pharmaceutical or clinical business, any medical business of any kind in California. But he relocated to the Fresno area and set up a lab, and then he skipped town from Fresno. and he disappeared. And he only resurfaced after Officer Harper followed the hose, the magic hose, into this hellish illegal lab in Reedley, California. Now, this man has been in this sector more or less for a long time. He initially worked in China in the early 2000s before then moving a few years later to Canada. And it was around, I think, 3 years ago or so, give or take, that he unlawfully entered the US. Now, this guy is not known as an eminent scientist. He's not known as a great businessman. In fact, very little is known about him, apart from some of the information that came forward from a congressional investigation that put out a report in November of 2023. And they found a lot of strange and unexplainable financial transactions between Chinese banks and this guy's accounts at American banks. So someone was paying for him. We do know that this is very, very big business. Dr. Meryl Nass, who myself and my colleague Niko Biggs Creopolis interviewed for this article.
The other Niko, guys, the actual Greek Niko, not just the Niko with the Greek name.
There you go. See, it all gets confusing. Chinese guys in Canada, Greeks everywhere. It's all Greek to me, but it was even Greek to the CDC, which is the weirdest part because they're supposed to speak this language. So this guy was operating in a field that's very lucrative. As I was saying, Dr. Nass was saying that certain transgenic mice can go for 1,000 per mouse, which seems a bit odd because if it were in your home, you'd usually pay someone a bit less than that to remove it from your home. But there you go. It's the transgenic bit that makes the mice valuable. And of course, these pathogens do have both a black market, gray market, and standard value. And it's a lot more than people would think. And so at minimum, best case scenario, this was a very shady character trying to make as much money as possible on both the black and gray market. Where the gray market comes into this is in the medical devices, the counterfeit medical devices he was selling out of this facility. And this included COVID tests that were misbranded, imported from China, and pregnancy tests that, when examined by Officer Harper's team locally, they found they only had a 22% accuracy rate, which could obviously pose horrific problems to women who would have relied on these. Some of them were sold online before the authorities intervened. And weirdly, I would say that holding the unlawful holding.
And this was being done in the same building?
It's being done in the same warehouse. Yep.
Wow.
It's all under one roof. It's, it's the Costco of weird illegal medical stuff. It was all there. If you wanted it, it was there.
22%.
22%.
That's crazy. I mean, so he was actually distributing. There were stores buying these pregnancy tests, is what you're telling me.
It was mainly online, but it's thought that there were probably some sales in the brick and mortar style. But yeah, he was for a while selling these online, which just goes to show you, don't just get one test, get several, because the provenance of these were as dodgy as it could get. The accuracy was negligible. It was just disgraceful, frankly. And the weird thing is, when you look at this all in totality, the holding of these pathogens, these experiments with mice, were ultimately the more frightening thing that he was doing of all of the dodgy things he was doing. Because these substances, if they were stored in a way that didn't lead them to decompose naturally, they could have easily leaked out and caused an epidemic or a pandemic. And in fact, there is some evidence that there may have been a leak from this lab, because one of the people working there who told Officer Harper that his job was to look after these transgenic mice, he reported to her that he and his children became ill shortly after they began the experiment, that he began working with these mice. And so that could potentially be, I mean, obviously correlation isn't causation, but it's certainly something that if you had a responsible CDC and a responsible NIH, they'd look into this as possible community transmission of some sort of pathogen. But no one was interested in that.
So before we get into them looking the other way, I got to ask, because you talked about the black market aspect of this, what could the black market use like transgenic mice for? Like what would their value be? I understand like you want to study them, but I mean, is the black market in the business of creating vaccines and so like I'm kind of like confused as to why there would be any value in that.
Hmm. Well, I would say that they have zero moral value, and in terms of ethics, they have negative equity. But in terms of the real world we're living in, which is governed by some of the most immoral and unethical people that you could meet in or out of a biolab, the value is derived from this word that we've been hearing a lot, this phrase called gain of function research. Now, this
Mm.
phrase has its origin in the bioweapons sector that really matured, at least in the US, after the Second World War. The Japanese were quite a bit ahead of any other country during the 1930s and the 1940s. Much like Operation Paperclip brought German rocket scientists and others to NASA, there was also a much lesser known version of this Operation Paperclip where the expertise from Japan was secretly brought into the US, and that was the basis of the American bioweapons programs that developed after the Second World War. Now, these programs went on until, well, they theoretically went on until the 1970s, where Tricky Dick was part of that's Nixon, for those of you who don't remember, was part of a treaty that came into force under the Ford administration in 75, which theoretically banned these kinds of bioweapons experiments that relied on the engineering of viruses to make them more pathogenic, more transmissible, increase their lethality to humans. But the problem,
Okay, I get it now.
mm, but the story gets
So
worse.
basically, it's the
Don't
only way
worry,
you
it
can do
gets worse.
the work legally, or not legally, but it's the only way you can do it and get away with it.
There always is. Unfortunately, when the people in power have a will, they usually find a way. And the way that they got around this was two things. One, the enforcement mechanisms were very, very weak. No one really had an interest in enforcing it. Because the issue isn't sort of a front burner issue, the way that the Vietnam War would have been at the time, the way that inflation would be at the time. I know that wars that nobody likes and inflation is something that no one in 2024 can relate to, but that's what it was like in the 70s. But so it went on, and one of the terminologies that they threw around in the 70s to do this was called dual use. Now, what were the two sides of that? Now, the justification was that one of those dual uses was for vaccine development, even though Robert Redfield, a former CDC director, said that no vaccine or any type of treatment, to his knowledge, has ever been successfully created as a result of gain of function research or dual use research. So it's been going on for decades, and bioweapons have certainly been engineered this way, but no effective treatment for anything, according to a former CDC director and many other eminent scientists around the world. It's never created anything useful. But it's big business because, one, weapons are big business, and that includes bioweapons just as much as it would include an F-35. And it's also because the vaccine industry is a big business, and from shareholders to directors to the people in government who may or may not be doing insider trading into these companies, vaccine business is big business, whether a vaccine is approved or not, whether it's effective or not, and whether it's mandated or not. Now, if it's mandated, that's of course the big payday. But there are many ways to get a payday out of an unsuccessful vaccine, and so this continued.
Yeah,
And
man. You know, I
continued.
heard isn't Ramaswamy good at that? He's good
Well,
at making a company that absolutely done nothing wrong, make a lot of money, or nothing right, make a lot of money. So apparently there
yeah,
is money in making in failing at making vaccines or vaccine technology.
absolutely. As long as you fail with style, then failing can be a big payday, and that's sort of the parasitic nature of this economy in which we live. That you can have people that are highly productive but who are in the red, and you can then have companies, many of them subsidized by the government, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly. They do either bad things or they do nothing at all, and they win big, a bit like a Nevada primary when none of the above ran the most effective campaign. That really sums up the whole thing.
Yeah, hey, really though. I mean, because what's funny about that is like the fact that we all know Nikki Haley's about to fall. into a multi-million-dollar job after an horrible and abysmal showing during her campaign, where she displayed that she has actually, despite being literally an ambassador, that where she spoke to foreign ambassadors from other foreign countries and superpowers around the world, she actually has zero idea what's going on in the world. Zero, none. And yet she's going to get a multi-million-dollar job after this, guaranteed. So
And the scariest part is she's only the second biggest quality control problem that Boeing has at the moment. So that just shows you where we are.
Seriously though. So we got a creepy financier, we have a lab that shouldn't have been, we have potential leaks. How there was obviously, well, I guess we can't call it a resolution, but there was a mandate for the lab to be destroyed. How did that process go?
Well, it really begins and ends with Jessalyn Harper, who, for all of the politicians that I'm happy to ridicule and make fun of and administrative heads, she's the example of someone who's not a bureaucrat, but a true public servant, because she realized the potential danger of this very early on and acted to get all of the responsible or supposedly responsible parties involved in this very early on. One of the first at a federal level she contacted was the FBI, and they did come down and they took a look, but weirdly, they dropped the case after a couple of weeks, saying, and I quote, there were no weapons of mass destruction found. I mean, that old chestnut keeps coming back, that line. Where there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, where of course they weren't, they found no weapons of mass destruction here, even though theoretically, if they were to have tested these pathogens, you could very well say that you had biological weapons of mass destruction. But the FBI said they weren't
sorry to interrupt, but this type of stuff was discovered in Ukraine. Now we know that it was actually the U.S. and Ukraine that created these labs, but the U.S. In Biden's administration came out and said it was a big deal to have these type of research labs because of the potential disastrous outcome that could come about if Russia were to get their hands on it. So it's interesting that all of a sudden the FBI is saying, no, these aren't weapons of mass destruction, which is once again what kind of makes me a little bit more curious as to who this financier actually is and if he has some backing. But go ahead.
No, absolutely right. They should have parachuted Tucker Carlson in waving a Russian flag, and then maybe Central California would have been protected. But so anyway.
Honestly, though, right? Maybe they definitely would have started paying. I mean, Hillary done came out of her coffin to talk about Tucker Carlson. So maybe that's all we need for Tucker Carlson to drop in with a Russian flag and a Putin t-shirt.
See, it solves everything, but unfortunately they didn't think of that at the time, and so the FBI left, and so the next agency that Harper wanted to get involved in this was the CDC. And you would think that when a local government, this was both the city of Reedley and the county of Fresno, both made calls to the state of California, that then they weren't really interested, so they made direct contacts over the phone to the CDC, and their calls were dropped. Sometimes they didn't pick up the phone at all when these people called. And I believe that because when I was trying to get a statement out of the CDC, they never seemed to be there. And it wasn't even leave a message no one will listen to after the tone. It was just call back some other time. Well, that some other time turned out to be every other time, which is really no other time. So eventually, feeling exasperated, Harper's colleague, the city manager, wrote to their local congressional representative, Jim Costa. And he's another example of one of the few people who really did his duty. He reached out directly to the CDC, said it's imperative that you come and take a look at this. And so around 5 months after Officer Harper discovered the biolab, the CDC in early May of 23, having discovered it in December of 22. I may have misspoke. Harper found it in 22, late 22. The CDC that gets there 5 months later in May of 23. They were there for just over 2 days, and they didn't really do much. And that's just not my assessment. It's the assessment of multiple congressional representatives who grilled CDC Director Mandy Cohen about this. So what did they do when they were there? They took a look around. They cataloged all of the pathogens that were labeled. They tested nothing, and they didn't even bother to translate the Chinese labels into English. So It just goes to show, if you don't want the CDC to find out what you're doing, just don't write in a language they can understand, because Google Translate is just a bit over their pay grade. Apparently, it sounds crazy, but this is literally what happened. They didn't. You would think and again, this was my gut instinct, because when in doubt, trust the reasonable person test, and I think we're all reasonable people here, even the people commenting online. But so not only does it fail the reasonable person test, which is used in criminal law all the time, but it also fails what Dr. Meryl Nass said is the standard operating procedure that the CDC would execute in such a situation. She said they should have taken custody of all of these substances and of the storage containers and of the mice and tested everything at a secure CDC lab, of which there are many, including in California, so you wouldn't have had to worry about safe transport across the country. They could have just gone, a few hours up the freeway at the Sacramento facility, she said, but they didn't do that. They said, well, there's nothing really to worry about, and they left it to the local people, the city and county, to dispose of these potential highly deadly pathogens.
The same city and county that didn't know the lab existed to begin with.
It all comes full circle.
So now we get back to the age-old question: do you believe this is incompetence, or do you believe that this was the not only the lab itself, but just the looking the other way? Because it isn't just the CDC looking the other way. Now you're talking about the FBI looking the other way. If the FBI is looking the other way, that probably means that Congress and other institutions are looking the other way. And once we get to that level, a lot of the time I end up being like, okay, maybe one or two people was incompetent, but when you have entire institutions, in this particular case, it's on the cusp of a pandemic that just passed, looking the other way. Now I'm like, I don't know. I can't really call everybody incompetent. At a certain point, somebody is looking the other way on purpose. But what do you think?
Well, unlike a counterfeit pregnancy test, which is only right 25% of the time, just flipping a coin of the incompetent or nefarious, a coin statistically wouldn't land on incompetent every single time. So I have to think that there is something nefarious. And I think, being someone who values logic, I don't want to jump to the most sinister conclusion, but let's start with the most likely nefarious cause, or nefarious explanation, rather. And here's what I think. We know that there are many of these labs, some of them government supervised because they're subsidized, some of them in the private sector, which have shockingly little regulatory oversight of any kind. And a lot of people, including Officer Harper, do suspect, and it's totally rational, that there are many labs like this, unlicensed, unauthorized, illegal biolabs operating around the United States and around the world. They're doing things that, as a former CDC director said, and I can't stress this enough, have no beneficial value to the human condition. They only have the potential to cause a lot of people to die, something far, far worse than COVID. And so I think that there's a factor of embarrassment that the CDC, NIH, all of these institutions, many elected officials, think that it's just perfectly fine for this to continue. And if they actually threw the book at what was going on in Reedley and really made an example of this man and this illegal, illicit institution, it would get people to question, why are we doing this legally? Because while the unauthorized and unclean labs pose somewhat more of a danger than the ones that are authorized, the CDC and the NIH was well aware of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and we all know how that story ended. So people would question the efficacy of these labs and why we are doing it. Why are we having a private sector running amok with this stuff? Why do we enforce the law so little against the illegal ones? And why are taxpayer dollars funding this in many cases at a giant scale, whether whether it's at universities in the US or whether it's in labs in countries like China or countries like Ukraine, where in the middle of a war is probably a really bad place to have a bioweapons lab. And I think that's why it's less of a cover up, although it may be that too, than a hush up, because they don't want to let this cat out of the bag. They want people to not know this happened, and those who do, they want them to forget about it, so we don't raise our voices and say ban gain of function now, which is what people should be saying.
Which also I thought was already banned. But what I
Well,
also find fascinating is the fact that this guy who was here is here, or at least to our knowledge, is still here in the U.S. illegally.
no.
How he's not being prosecuted because the lab was illegal. The operating procedures were also illegal. I mean, hell, you can go with false advertisement for as far as the pregnancy test. Like there are so many things to pin on him that you would assume that there would at least be a court case, right?
Well, he's been arrested and indicted, but not for these pathogenic substances or the mice or any of that. His arrest came from an FDA complaint that the Justice Department then followed up, and this was in October. His arrest was in October of 23. His indictment was a month later, and this was in relation to what, in the scheme of things, was probably the least worrying of his activities, and these were the misbranded goods, the medical test, the pregnancy test, the COVID test, and then lying to the authorities about those. All in all, and this is according to the Justice Department, he faces 8 years maximum. I'm thinking he'll probably bargain it down to a lot less, maybe
If he even goes
even.
to jail, it could be
I,
probation. It's
I,
not
I
gonna be
think it's a
probation.
strong possibility he won't, and so they have arrested him, but not for what they ought to have arrested him for, in my opinion.
It's almost like we're being gaslighted, right? It's like, look at
Yeah.
all these things over here that he did. Don't look at the stuff that he should probably be getting life for, and also, that we should have probably known about, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's very convenient, and we see that they do it both with things they want us to forget about and with things that they want us to be incensed about. I mean, because free speech is protected by the First Amendment, it took a long time for them to put Julian Assange behind bars. So they made up a totally fake story about sexual innuendo and relations, and then
Mhm.
they said, oh well, he had a bail infraction, which he served the time for that already 10 times over. And so you see they use these weapons of mass distraction on both ends of the spectrum when they want to enrage people about things where they should not be enraged, and when they want people to forget about the things that they should be paying attention to. It works both ways, and that's what I see here. I'm not saying that it's good to sell misbranded and ineffective medical devices. That's very bad, but potentially causing a worse pandemic than COVID, I think, is at least a bit worse.
Yeah, especially when you're doing so via black market, like like black market like infecting mice and using. I mean, I remember when we were talking about it on the Kennedy Beacon podcast, you were telling me that when the staff was addressed, they were like, yeah, you can call the guy in China, they can probably help you, but they're not going to answer. So good luck with that one. Like, what the hell, right?
Yeah.
And now we get back to the point with the Wuhan lab, the fact that that was allowed, not only was allowed to exist, we also know obviously at this point that the US was involved. And then there was just millions and millions upon millions of dollars being shipped back and forth to make sure that the lab stayed open. And then when everything went down, everyone acted like they didn't know what was happening. When the money showed that at least somebody should have known what was going on if we're sending hundreds of millions of dollars there, right? I feel like somebody should have known. But there's another situation where someone was able to skip town in Canada while they owe somebody a lot of money, do so illegally, come here and start an illegal lab while doing other illegal shit. And the only thing that gets brought up isn't the fact that he was using a fake identity, isn't the fact that he had an illegal lab, it's the fake pregnancy test, right? Like at a certain point, once again, it's hard to not assume more nefarious and deliberate intent, and that's just where I'm at with it. So what's the final? So you said it's going to be multiple parts. So where are we at right now in the story, and then what can people expect to see next?
So part 1 and part 2 are out now, and then part 3 is going to be the unedited interview that we conducted with Officer Jesselyn Harper, the woman who
Oh, that's gonna be
discovered
good.
and blew the lid on all of this. Now, she's a really interesting person, apolitical, a genuine public servant who had a real concern about just the potential danger that this posed to her community. And she's clearly highly intelligent, really motivated, and is following through with this. She's now conducting courses to teach other code enforcement officers how to protect themselves and others should they stumble upon one of these labs. Because when she walked in there, she was just wearing regular clothes from the street,
Oh,
which was a huge risk because usually the CDC would wear what they call their moon suits, like their hazmat suits. If anyone remembers the old Intel Inside commercials, but she went inside just like you or me or anyone, and so she's now, that was, luckily she's fine, but it was a huge
that could
risk
have been bad.
unbeknownst to her. So she's training people, she's spreading awareness, and this is an instance of someone outside of this false dichotomy of left and right and politics and all the other. She's just saying, look, let's at least do what we can to make people aware of this problem, how to spot one of these labs, and what to do if you find one. And
You know,
she's
she
helping people in that way.
she's really one of the bright spots of the story. You know, because as much as we have to rightfully so focus on a lot of the negative stuff that happens in this world, the only reason that this story blew up to the degree that it did was because one person who had no agenda but to do her job and to do it the right way, regardless of the risk, decided to speak out, and is still choosing to speak out, and that's dope. Honestly,
Yep.
I mean that's amazing because
Yep.
I always, I'm in my ripe old age of 35. Uh, you kind of get jaded, man. You get jaded after you're like, damn, does anybody actually care about people anymore? Or is it everybody's looking out for themselves and, taking the easy way out and trying to take shortcuts and only in it for their ambitions? And yet, for those of you who don't know, if you've never been in law enforcement or anything like this type of story you can lose your job
Yep.
because there's politics even at that level. And somebody could tell her look the other way, and she's the type of person that would say no, and yet and still she chose to continue to pursue this story to make sure that everything was destroyed and to make sure that the right authorities were called. And now in California is, by the way, a hotbed for this type of stuff. Not just lab leaks. I mean, some military. It's like there's a lot of military um, personnel and a lot of military facilities in California that people aren't really all that aware of. So this type of California is a hotbed for this type of stuff, and for her to even go the extra mile and prepare others to do this out of her own goodwill, that's just really dope, man. That's really dope. So, where can people find you at, Adam?
Well, the best place is probably at the Kennedy Beacon. I'll probably be expanding into other social media too. But at this point, if you go to the Kennedy Beacon, you can find my articles there. You can find other really interesting articles from really interesting people there. There's something new, multiple pieces new every day, and a great podcast there. Yeah, so that's where I am. And I'm also in the ether. And luckily, I've not been exposed to any lab leaks. So
Yeah, so
I should be around for a while because I don't know anything about Hillary Clinton at all. So I'll be alive and well for a while.
man, that must be nice because I'm still looking over my shoulder because of the DNC fraud lawsuit. Seriously, yeah. You want to hear a funny story, Adam?
Yeah, of course.
I went to go. So I had my channel blew up after I was exposing Kamala with stories that no one had ever heard of at the time, and for some reason, progressives were kind of weird about talking about her. And so I go to California to cover the DNC convention. I come back the last day actually of my trip. As I'm like flying back, my car gets towed with tickets that from a neighborhood I didn't stay in and that had accumulated over time. And then they took my license plate and then they give you like 24 hours before they towed the car, but that's not what actually happened. They took my license plate within like a couple of hours. They took my car and then I had to pay $800 in tickets I've never seen before. Yeah. Now, context for that. I lived in Broward County, which is Debbie Wasserman Schultz district.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's the type of stuff I was dealing with since we started the DNC fraud lawsuit. And that's like the least crazy story. The people that I was working with, Jerry and Elizabeth Lee Beck, their secretary got threatened. for being their secretary because they were helping with the DNC fraud lawsuit. So yeah, man, it's real when you mess with the Clintons, they tend to mess back. So, but we're still here, we're still kicking. We don't keep fighting like Officer Jessica. All right, guys. So with that being said, I got both of the links to both of those articles in my description on YouTube. Make sure you go check those articles out. You can subscribe to the Kennedy Beacon podcast through those articles, to the Kennedy Beacon publication through those articles as well. And yeah, make sure you like this video. Make sure you share this video. If you want to support us, you can do so by supporting our Patreon, supporting, you can donate through Bitcoin address, you can donate through Cash App, PayPal, all that good stuff. But of course, whatever, sharing and liking is just as effective as well. We want to get the message out however we can, because this type of stuff these are the stories that that people need to see. Right. I know COVID's over, if it ever really started, but the story of COVID rather is over. But this type of stuff is the stuff they don't really want y'all to see, because the patterns, guys, the patterns are important to acknowledge. And we're starting to see the patterns that the CDC, these institutions are either looking the other way on accident, looking the way on purpose, are ridiculously incompetent or maliciously ignorant. But either way, it's a problem. And we need to put more pressure on them, and we need to document this type of stuff. And Adam and Nikos have been fantastic at doing so. So make sure you go follow them there on the Kennedy Beacon blog. Other than that, ladies and gentlemen, always remember, more than anything else, find your balance. Peace.